Hello, everyone. My name is Denise White, and I am the host of the Coffee in the Green Room podcast. Here in Coffee in the Green Room, we have those conversations you may not have in front of the stage, but you definitely have behind the stage. Today, I am so excited to have Joe Stolte here. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is great.
You're welcome. So, Joe, you have built and exited multiple companies as an entrepreneur. So, before I have you tell me that story, can you start with how did you find out that you were an entrepreneur? How did you get your start?
Yeah, good question. And I always love to point out that for like every success I've had, I probably had like 3 or 5x the number of failures. So, but yeah, I knew from a very young age that I was going to be an entrepreneur as young as like probably first grade, second grade. You know, I was raised in the 80s. My father was in the military and he traveled instead of having us travel. My mom worked 2 jobs. I grew up in this like farm town of less than 1,000 people. And so I walked to school at a really young age, and my parents didn't have time to make me lunch. They gave me money to buy my lunch. But the school lunches always kind of sucked. So my first entrepreneurial hustle, if you will, was I would go to the store, the convenience store on the way to school, and I would buy all the candy that I could get, and I would trade candy for like the best food in the lunchroom. And then it was just like one hustle after another to be creative and resourceful. The next thing that I did was, I was probably like 10, I think 9 or 10. My father had taught me how to mow the lawn when he was on a break from the military, but I really didn't like mowing the lawn. So in my little farm town, there wasn't very many places to make money, and I was too young to get a job. So people would mow lawns for money. And so what I did is I would knock on these doors and ask people to, will you pay me $10 and I'd mow your lawn? But then instead of mowing people's lawns, which I tried to do but sucked at, I went and asked my friends if I could borrow their lawnmowers. And because I lived in a farm town, there's a bunch of migrant workers, people that spoke Spanish and were working on the farms, like picking berries as seasonal workers. So a friend of mine speaks Spanish, and I was like, hey, can you ask them if they'll mow lawns for $5? And so I basically got them to mow the lawns for $5. I kept $5, and that's how I funded like my school clothes outfits. I really wanted to buy like some Jordan sneakers and Guess overalls and a Raiders starter jacket. This was in the early 90s. So like
That's awesome.
The youngest possible age. I could keep going, but I have all these stories where I've just done stuff like that.
That's awesome. So how translate that from hustling candy and mowing lawns to where you are now?
Yeah, it's been kind of like an evolution of following my desires, or like what I really want in life, I guess. I never really thought about it as entrepreneurship. I just would think about like, oh, I really want something, and I wouldn't let money or if there's a wall there, I would go over it, go around it, or break through it kind of mentality. Yeah. And so yeah, that took a lot of different directions after I left high school. Instead of going into like college and going into like corporate America, I actually was a professional dancer for many, many years.
Really? That's cool.
Yeah, and I was a professional break dancer. So my breakdancing group, we won 2 world titles. The mayor of Seattle gave us our own day twice,
Wow.
and on and on. We toured and did a bunch of stuff. But the main way that I was able to survive from doing that, because at that time you couldn't make any money doing that or any livable wages, is I would basically find these side hustles and odd things to do to stay alive. But then eventually, like a mentor of mine took me under his wing, and I got inspired to go to college. I worked in management consulting. I spent a few years at Microsoft. And then one day I woke up and was like, man, I don't want to work in a corporate company. I want to go try and do something really impactful in the world. And so my desire, had shifted. At the time, my desire back in the day was to eat good school lunch, then to have cool school clothes. And then my desire was to just be a dancer. And then now my desire was like, hey, how can we use technology to really change the world, to help people's lives, make money, and make an impact? And for the last 10, 11 years, that's really been the path that I'm on, is just how do we do that? And, we've been fortunate enough. I'm a 5th-time founder. We've had 3 successful exits and a couple of really brutal, difficult failures along the way. But that's the translation, it's like, hey, just following my kind of inner signal of desire and then trying to figure out how do we make that true in the real world.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you've mentioned the word failures a couple times, and it's something normal people don't like talking about failures, but I feel like entrepreneurs, they're like, yeah, I failed so many times. It's like the complete opposite. So for my listeners, a lot of them are actors, models, and musicians. And for them, rejection and failure is like something they like shrink back from. But how do you take a failure and overcome it? Like think of like one of the companies that you mentioned that failed. Like how do you take the lessons that you learned and apply them so that you don't make the same mistake more than once?
Yeah, well, there's two things that I think are valuable to share here. The first thing, something that my mentor shared for me in a very young age is he said, hey, don't spend more than 24 hours sulking after a loss or a setback, and don't spend more than 24 hours celebrating after a huge win, no matter how big the loss or how big the win, because tomorrow is another day, right? And every day you're just back in, right? And so that really helped set my mindset, because even with our exits, I would be like, all right, don't get too comfortable. Let's get back and go again. And that's why I've been able to go back and start so many companies. But on the failures, there's lots of ways I think to approach this. I think what's been helpful for me is like, even as a creative, as a dancer, we performed a lot, we auditioned, we went on tour, we did music videos and lots of different media and commercials. And so like what I would think about is I would try to, because as a creative, as a creator, I'm so creative, I'm channeling a lot of energy or my own channel or what's going on for me and trying to turn that into my art. But what was really helpful for me is I just started thinking about it more like a scientist. If I wasn't a scientist running an experiment and it didn't work, like you kind of expect most experiments not to work. So I would look at each audition or each practice or each thing as like a little experiment and go, oh, well, that didn't work, but here's why. Let me change that one thing. And so like as a dancer, I would record everything that I did, like all the moves that I was practicing. And then I would go back and watch the tape, run the tape and see what was working and what wasn't, and just try to find one thing to improve. So now all of a sudden, why does that help? Because when you're thinking about it from a scientist perspective, you're curious, right? You're curious about what was going on here. And when you're in curiosity, it's just a higher state of consciousness than anxiety, overwhelm, stress, frustration, sadness. So curiosity is like an immediate shift to get you into a more powerful, productive state. And then you can actually bring your awareness to feel like, oh, how could I do a little bit better? And I never, ever expect anything to be perfect. And I don't always expect things to go my way, but I hold a vision in my mind of what it's going to look and feel like when it does go my way. And then I compare what I recorded or what I saw to that vision I have in my head. And I'm usually like, oh man, there's so many things I could fix. Let me just pick one though, so I don't get overwhelmed. Pick that one thing and do it again. It was the same thing when I started making social media content. Like a few years back, I made a 1-minute Instagram video every day for a year. And it was just terrible at first, but I just picked one thing to improve. And by the end of the year, I felt really, really comfortable and I could get a lot concisely expressed in 1 minute. But it came from the same process. Like, how do I shift my perspective? So I'm not thinking about it as end of life, failure, success. It's more like, oh, if I was a scientist, how could I look at this like an experiment and find one tweak to make in order to make this the next version of this successful? So
I love that mentality. I think if actors and models and musicians were to see each audition as an experiment, I love that analogy, because then you're like, okay, you know what, you don't expect every experiment to be successful, because that's the nature of the beast. So I love that, because that takes so much pressure off of whatever you're doing. Even as an entrepreneur, a lot of times there's a lot of money on the line when you're an entrepreneur. But if you see the different things that you do as an experiment, then that takes that sting of quote unquote failure out of the whole process.
Yeah, and there's some really more nuanced things here from a mindset perspective that I can't speak to everyone else's experience and say, oh, this is what you'll experience. But my experience has been kind of walking this fine line between like delusional levels of certainty when I need to be in performance mode. And then humble curiosity afterwards, which are sort of very different headspaces to be in. They're very antithetical in some space, but you kind of need both. You need to be able to turn that certainty switch on when you're in performance mode. Then you have to turn that curiosity, that humble sort of what can I learn student mode on after. And I think if you can just think about your own state and how to shift the state between those two things, it makes this it makes this like the audition process easier. And I tell you why I think auditions are so difficult. From even now, like I'm a startup entrepreneur. I pitch for venture capital. In some ways, it's like an audition. It's like a really long audition, and it feels really bad when somebody arbitrarily passes judgment on your art. like on your most creative expression, or like kind of your heart, like how much you poured into this thing that you've created, whether that's your performance or some other form of creativity, which for me, business is just a giant canvas that I'm painting on. And so it can be, I can just want to acknowledge can be very emotionally trying. And I think that you're inclined, and you should feel those emotions. I just don't think it's very useful to stay in that place for longer than a day. Then you can get back to work. But I do want to acknowledge, man, it's hard. It's hard to take that, to have that courage and to do it. But I will say that I don't know a single person that I've ever encountered that has just committed to making one little improvement, and then also committed to keeping their feet moving and not giving up and continuing to try, that has failed over the long run, right? You know, that old saying, we tend to overestimate what we can do in a year, but underestimate what we can do in 10. I think somebody said that, Bill Gates said that. I think that's so true. You just have to keep your feet moving and have what I call long-term optimism and short-term pessimism. Expect to fail in the short term and improve it, but also just expect that if you keep doing that, you're going to win no matter what.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because you keep making steps forward, and that's the most important part, is the forward progress.
Yeah, just get up and go the next day. I call it the Rocky mentality. You know, just don't give up. Just keep your feet moving.
That's awesome. So, Joe, what are you most proud of? You've accomplished so many things. What is one thing that you're like the most proud of?
Yeah, this might be a little not obvious and counterintuitive, but it's appropriate to my stage of life. So I'm in my 40s now, and I have 2 kids, and I'm a founder. I'm a founder of what you might call a 0 to 1 startup, which just means we aren't in scale mode just yet. We're very, very close. And you know, if I didn't have kids, I probably wouldn't be doing this, because I've already done this before, and it feels like ground I've already covered. But I'm really proud of the fact that I'm doing this sort of with a new set of rules, a new set of parameters, which is I have to prioritize my family. Right? There's no scenario where I deprioritize critical moments with my family. And so what that looks like is, you know, dinner every night with the family. What that looks like is I don't travel without my family, only on very rare occasions, but I bring them everywhere we go. You know, I must have done like 30 or 40 keynotes this year, and 90% of them, I just bring my wife and my 2 kids, and we just go, you know, because I want them to have that experience, but also I want to be able to be around them and still have them a part of my lives, and vice versa. So it's a whole different set of challenges when it's like, okay, like in order to be successful as a CEO, I have to manage my energy, which means I have to take care of my body. I have to get enough sleep. I have to leave enough headspace for my children. So it's like 3-dimensional chess. It's a little different version of the game that I'm playing now. And I enjoy it. It's much more difficult, but it's much more rewarding when we win. So
I was reading, I'm in the middle of reading Kevin Harrington's book, Mentor to Millions. And I love that in the beginning of the book, he talks about how that's his priority too. He, like, his goal is like, he's in a stage of his life right now where he wants to prioritize his family as well as business. And I think a lot of times entrepreneurs and even creatives, they're not willing, but they don't realize that you don't have to sacrifice your home life for your business life. Like, there are definitely stages where you're working more hours. Like when you're in the beginning of a startup, you're going to work more hours, but I love that you're prioritizing family, because I feel like so many times I've interviewed so many entrepreneurs, and so few people talk about like how you have to balance your family, because why else are you doing this?
yeah, totally. And I think it all comes down to motivation too. You know, one school of thought around motivation is that we're primarily motivated by just things we want to move towards, and things we want to move away from. And there's if you study cognitive biases, generally speaking, we're twice as motivated to move away from things we don't want as we are to move towards things that we do want. And I love, there's a mental model that I think Jeff Bezos has. It's called the regret minimization framework. It's like, if I have to make a choice between 2 things, well, which one will produce the least amount of regret over time? Because and that sort of capitalizes on this idea of like, I want to move away from pain. And so like if this business fails, like I will regret that significantly less than if I spent all the time doing that, not spending any time with my kids, you know, or the critical times with my kids. So it's an easy choice for me, right? That's the kind of set of operating systems and applications in my head that I keep running when I want to stay focused on you know, having my cake and eat it too when it comes to work and family. But I think, generally speaking, I think we have a much higher upper limit of what's capable and what's possible for us than we give ourselves credit for.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it starts with just being able to imagine the future that you want in your mind. You know, I think I tend to be an and person instead of an or person. Anytime someone gives me an or choice, I immediately think, well, how can I have both? You know, I think if you train
Yeah.
yourself to think like that, your brain can't help but go and find new and interesting ways to explore that question. It's a powerful question.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it's important to keep in mind, like anytime you feel like you've hit your upper limit, it's almost entirely in your mind, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. When you ask better questions, you get better answers out. So I love that. That's awesome. Well,
yeah.
Joe, one question I love to ask on the podcast is, at the end of the day, in like 20, 30, 40, 50 years, what do you want your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I don't necessarily know if I want people to care or remember me. You know, I like if people want that in their lives, I honor and respect that they want that. I'm in a place in my life where like 20-year-old Joe would have been like, oh, like, and had the list of things, but I don't necessarily want you to remember me, right? Like I just want to materially leave the world a better place. Right? I want the things that we create to improve people's lives. I want the money that I make to go towards things that literally actually saves human lives. And if you never remembered me, but we had that kind of impact with like, my family and the teams that I work with, and that would be excellent, you know? But I think one common thought to answer the question in a more classical way is like, I like the idea that people that met me even like 3 or 5 years ago will be inclined to say something like, oh man, I knew Joe back when X, you know, and to never have that stop. Because if that not because I have like a egoic need to like increase my status, it's more like if I keep pushing to find out what's possible for me, then that will automatically be true, you know. And it's like I have friends that I was close with, you know, even before I had my kids. My oldest kid is just under 5 years old, and you know they and I knew them really well up until the point of having kids. And but you know, I'm such a different person, and in every way, including the kind of accomplishments that I've had and the things that I'm thinking about now. And so if I just keep doing that, like imagine the example that's going to set for my kids. You know, that seems pretty cool. So I like the idea that everyone's constantly looking at me and saying, "Oh, I remember Joe when he was X," meaning like he's now somewhere else on another stratosphere, but I knew him when he was wherever before. I like the idea of that. That means that I've kept my feet moving and didn't give up.
That's awesome. I love that. So, Joe, where can people find you? If someone's listening to this podcast and they're like, I need to know more about Joe, where can they find you?
You can find me at mostly on Instagram. My handle is Joe Stolte Live, or just Google my name, Joe Stolte. There's you'll find all the ways to get in touch with me. But other than that, I guess the other way to get a hold of me or follow what I'm up to is, you know, like right now I'm the CEO of a company called Daily.ai, and we build AI automated email newsletters for thought leaders and small brands, everybody from, you know, New York Times bestselling authors to nonprofits and service-based businesses and real estate agents, that kind of thing. And that's, you know, other than my family, that really is where I spend a lot of my time. We have a vision to, you know, impact 1 billion people with what we call positive news. So, you know, we use AI to curate people's newsletters, email newsletters, and they get 40 to 60% open rates. But we filter out negative news and clickbait and quite frankly, a lot of stuff that causes us to go into that fight or flight mode. And we actually serve up what we consider, what we call future forward positive content, just content that helps you learn, helps you grow, and of course brings more attention to you and your business so you can get more leads and sales. But yeah, that's the main thing I'm focused on. And if you want to know what I'm working on, I mean, that's it. Daily.ai. That's my main focus right now.
Awesome. And we love our newsletter. Our latest edition just came out today. I was like, oh, it's the newsletter. I'm talking to Joe in just a couple minutes. That's awesome.
Amazing. I love that. Yeah, that's the reaction that we want. You know, it's like yeah, I mean, email newsletters are such a powerful marketing mechanism, but they take so much time, you know, and as you can probably attest to, we've got it down to where if you're a brand or a publisher putting a newsletter out, it takes less than 5 minutes of your time a week to review the content. And our AI literally does everything else in the background with our human team to give the human touch. But yeah, we're excited. This is just the beginning, you know, like our vision inside of this is to really do this beyond email and lots of other channels to help brands grow and reach more people positively and grow their businesses, of course.
Awesome. Well, Joe, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And
yeah, my pleasure.
For anyone listening, make sure you hit subscribe to the Coffee in the Green Room podcast, because if you thought that this interview with Joe was amazing, just wait. The best is yet to come. But so Joe, thank you again so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much.